First will come our keynote speaker, Wendy Pulling, Director of Conservation Programs, the Nature Conservancy, San Francisco.
Thanks very much. Good morning. It's great to be here with all of you. And really appreciate the opportunity to join you and at this important conference. My 9-year-old son, Alec, got home yesterday from a 3-day environmental education field trip. His entire 4th grade class went on it. And they learned about plankton, they learned about crabs, they learned about tides. They hiked along beaches, they hiked up on trails on the bluffs, they hiked along wetlands and riparian zones. They had a great time. It was striking to me, a great reminder that living here in the Bay Area, he and his classmates were able to do all of this, almost a near wilderness experience within an hour's drive of our home in Berkeley. They went out to the Marin Headlands, as you might imagine. And it was a great reminder of the fact that our green belt, our open space, 3 million or so acres, contributes so much to the quality of life that we enjoy here in the Bay Area. Thanks to all of you, to all of us, we have a great legacy of conservation here in the Bay Area. Those 3 million acres make a huge difference. But as we sit here today, we also know that about 9% of that green belt could be developed at any minute. About 60% of it is only temporarily protected. So our work, if you will, is not done. But the good news, if you will, is that we have a potentially very potent new source of capital to bring to this problem, and a potent new set of ideas to bring to this problem. And that's what we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about, and I think other panelists will talk about today. And that is this notion. It's described as natural capital, ecosystem services. The notion is that there are a stream of benefits that nature provides to all of us people that can be quantified, and that by quantifying those benefits, we can leverage additional capital, build additional public will for conservation. So hold that thought in mind, and I'll give you a few examples. We're going to travel from New York City to Palo Alto to Quito, Ecuador, to Ventura County, and then we'll come back to the Bay Area, and hopefully by the end of that visit across the Americas, I will have convinced you that this notion of ecosystem services can be a really powerful tool for conservation here in the Bay Area. So let me start with my kid, Alec. If we could quantify the benefits to him and his classmates of being able to get out and get this environmental education field trip over the past few days, over the course of their life, and we could then impute that cost back and say, wow, this is what the Marin Headlands, this is some value of the Marin Headlands. We really can't do that. So that's not what ecosystem services is. To help illustrate what it is, I'm going to turn to, do we have New York? There we go, to my hometown, New York City. Any other New Yorkers in here? Anybody lived in New York? Okay, good. We know how good that drinking water tastes, right? It really does. And you may think this is an unlikely place to start. New York City, what do they know about conservation, and what could they possibly teach us in the Bay Area? But it turns out that New York City provides a very good example of this concept of natural capital or ecosystem services. So behind me is part of New York City's drinking water. New York City has a watershed of about 1 million acres. It gets its water from upstate New York. And in the 1980s, it realized it had a problem. And that was that its watershed was going to be subject to increasingly more and more stringent drinking water rules from the US EPA. The rules are a good thing. They protect our public health from bacteria and viruses that can actually kill people. And this more stringent set of rules and regulations that the US EPA was handing down to New York and every other water provider in the US basically said to New York City, you're going to need to build a giant water filtration plant to filter all of this surface water, all this water from the Hudson and the Delaware rivers, to make sure that there is no Giardia, there is no cryptosporidium, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, New York City said, that's going to cost us about 8 to 10 billion, with a B, dollars to build, and about $300 million a year in annual operating costs. Can we get the same benefit? Can we protect public health at the same level without building that expensive solution? And the answer they got to, and were able to convince the US EPA of by 1997, was, can you flip the slide? Was to work in their watershed, which is here in green. New York City's down at the bottom there in sort of yellow, the bottom of the Hudson River, and you can see the watershed. To work up in that watershed to let nature, if you will, do the filtering of the water. Now, New York City did not own that entire watershed and still doesn't to this day. Most of that land, New York City owns some, most of that land is actually in private ownership. Farmers, dairy farmers, foresters, timber companies. And what New York City did was to provide a fund that could be used to get those land owners to manage the land, manage that watershed to better effect, to better filter water. So think about it this way. If you're a dairy farmer, as many folks are in those green blobs there, you may be letting your cows wander into the creeks. You may be where, of course, they do their business, and that business is the source of much water contamination. If you own forested lands, you may be cutting trees very close to the watershed, and after big storm events, lots of mud and debris runs into the water, creating turbidity, which is very difficult to, if you're a water treatment plant or a water provider, you don't want turbidity. So there were land practices that these landowners were engaging in, not because they wanted to pollute New York's water system, but because they were trying to make a living off the land. New York City decided to do, working with these communities and these private landowners, is let's set up a fund to actually incentivize them to keep their cows out of the stream and to keep their timber harvest back from the stream. Pay them, basically, to be stewards of the land in a way that would benefit New York City. Long story short, as I said, it took many years of negotiation with US EPA, but the city of New York ended up protecting its watershed and treating its water to the quality that US EPA needed, not for the cost of 8 to 10 billion plus 300 million every year, but to the tune of $1.5 billion. So hold that in mind. Think about that avoided cost, if you will, of $6 billion plus 300 million a year. And think about nature and natural capital as providing, if you will, the difference. That's the New York City example. Now, I told you we'd come out to Palo Alto, so who here has lived in Palo Alto, gone to school down there? Okay, good. All right. Go Stanford. Stanford University professor Gretchen Daly is really, I would say, the intellectual force behind this notion of natural capital or ecosystem services. Back in 1997, she published an article called Nature's Services. She later published a book, 2002, which some of you may have heard of, called The New Economy of Nature. She's been very influential in really creating this body of intellectual thought around natural capital. And in 2006, Professor Daly created, with the Nature Conservancy where I work, the World Wildlife Fund, and the University of Minnesota, a center at Stanford called Natural Capital, NatCap. And NatCap exists to this day. It provides, one of the things that NatCap has is this tremendously powerful software called Invest, and it's available online for free. I guess they call it open source, I think. Invest enables users to go in and quantify, using dollars and cents, the ecosystem services of different natural capital. So, for example, you can enter data into Invest and quantify proactively the value of land in its current form. And you can then quantify the benefit, let's say, of, well, those wetlands are providing flood risk to nearby communities. And if we got rid of those wetlands, what would that community have to pay to get a comparable level of flood protection? And Professor Daly and her colleagues and this NatCap enterprise have been using these tools around the world to try to, again, bring a new type of thinking to conservation. So let's go down to Quito, if you can switch the slide, Ecuador, the next stop on our journey. The lessons of New York City certainly offer great promise when we consider supplying water to the booming cities across Latin America. And the Nature Conservancy had this thought in mind when it went down to the city of Quito in 2000 and began to work with that city to protect its watershed. And you can see from the picture here that Quito is about 2 million people. Like New York, its watershed is up in the mountains. And like New York, its watershed is inhabited by people who work the land. Now, unlike New York, it turns out that Quito and Ecuador, the country of Ecuador, own most of that land in the watershed. In New York, it was the other way around, right? New York didn't own much of the land. But here, Quito does actually own the land. It's publicly owned. And in the 1990s, the late 1990s, the city realized that up in the watershed, more and more problems were occurring because of the way the land was being managed. The people up there were mostly living subsistence, and they needed to let their cattle and their sheep range freely, and we know what that means. They get into the water. They, too, were deforesting, again, for subsistence purposes, and that creates sedimentation. So problems were emerging in the watershed. The city owned the land, but the city didn't have enough money to properly manage it. So the city had a shortfall of capital. TNC and the city of Quito's water district got together in 2000 and created something which is now called a water fund. We put some seed capital in, the notion that we would create an endowment that would spit off enough interest every year to begin to pay the upstream inhabitants of Quito's watershed to adopt more water-friendly, if you will, land management practices. Started small. A couple of years after, later, 2002, 2003, Quito's local beer distillery added money to the fund, realizing that their business was dependent on clean water and abundant water. So did a big local water bottler in the city of Quito add money to this fund. And then in 2006, a really great thing happened, which was that same water entity that we partnered with in 2000 saw that this was beginning to work and saw the promise of these investments upstream in the watershed. And that water authority has now, in 2006, committed to set aside 1% of the revenues from its ratepayers every year to put into this fund. So the fund is now stands at about $10 or $11 million and throws off $800,000 a year in interest, which gets spent to provide incentives, frankly, to, in some cases, even subsidize some of the land, some of the people who occupy the watershed, to make sure that what they're engaged in can continue to be a going concern, but not interfere with Quito's drinking water. It's a pretty powerful concept, and this Quito example is not unique. Working with Natural Capital, Gretchen Daly's enterprise down at Stanford, the Nature Conservancy and its partners are working in 30 cities around Latin America to establish water funds. And they're in different stages of establishment at this point. But imagine the promise that holds for providing water to 50 million people in Latin America while also conserving habitat and stimulating local economies in a more sustainable way. Very powerful tool. We'll go to one more example and bring it closer to home. And that's, if you can show the next slide, this beautiful spot in Southern California, Ventura County. Anybody from Ventura County? Oh, wow, good, all right. I was wondering if anybody would be. So you all recognize the Santa Clara River. What most of us Northern Californians may not know is that the Santa Clara River is the only remaining undammed river in Southern California and one of the least altered rivers in the entire state. Its headwaters are up actually in LA County. If you've driven down through the Tehachapi's on I-5, there's the city Santa Clarita. The headwaters of the Santa Clara River are all the way up there in LA County. It drains the watershed coming into Ventura County and then flows out to the ocean through the city of Ventura and then Oxnard. The Nature Conservancy got interested in the Santa Clara River and began investing in this river in 2000. And the reason we went there was because we wanted to make sure that this river remained unaltered. We wanted to, it's tremendously rich in biodiversity, habitat to hundreds of plants and animals, including 18 that are threatened and endangered. All right, so this is one of the last strongholds for 18 different species of plant and animal. And we went in there wanting to protect this biodiversity and conserve it. We soon realized that big metropolitan area, Los Angeles, right over the hills, 12 million people, hadn't arrived yet, but you know, we wouldn't be shocked if people started moving in over those hills. And we wouldn't be shocked, in fact, we were quite concerned, that development would spread right on down to the banks of the river, to the floodplain area. That was what we were trying to guard against in our work there. And we've been going along doing that work with some success, buying the land in the floodplain. But along the way, we also realized something else, and this is where the natural capital comes in. In working with the local flood control district, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. We realized that there was tremendous value to people in keeping this floodplain a floodplain. We knew there was tremendous value to plants and animals in keeping this floodplain a floodplain and keeping the surrounding land undeveloped as well. But what we learned along the way was there was a quantifiable benefit to the downstream inhabitants of Ventura and Oxnard if we could keep this floodplain a floodplain. If you go to the next slide. And the way this works is as follows. Imagine that residential development or highly intensive agriculture, commercial development is allowed to proceed into the river's floodplain. They would need, the flood control district would then need to put in levees, right, to protect those businesses and people right along the river. So you start hardscaping, channelizing, putting levees in the river. What does the river then do? Then the river in flood events turns into a really raging source of water and increasing the flood damage potential to the downstream cities of Oxnard and Ventura significantly, and probably requiring more hardscaping down there to provide flood control. So that's what this phrase here, levees along 80% of the river, right? If the river gets developed and you put levees around 80% of it, it would result downstream in a 100-year flood, $204 million worth of damage, and in one of those really monstrous 500-year floods, over $1 billion worth of damage. Well, obviously, if you're in the city of Oxnard, if you're an elected official there in the city of Oxnard or Ventura, or you work for the local flood control district, it's your job to make sure those things don't happen. It would cost $300 million to protect Ventura and Oxnard from the risk of a 100-year flood. And that's the course that the flood control district would be on. In other words, they would need to go out, get $300 million, and begin building a hardscape protection for those cities. But for one thing, the floodplain isn't developed yet. And so what the Nature Conservancy, what we're doing down on the Santa Clara River, is working with that flood control district and other partners to keep the floodplain from being developed, either buying the land or putting easements over the working landscape there, let the farmers stay in business, but pay those farmers to let it flood. When the river tops its banks, those farmers will be, if you will, compensated for any losses that they incur to their crops, thereby preventing massive damage to the downstream communities. So this notion of a different kind of ecosystem service, if you will. With New York and the city of Quito, the ecosystem service was clean drinking water. In this example, the ecosystem service is flood protection. The thing that I really like about this example too is I'm not going to stand here and tell you that we had this all figured out before we started working there in 2000. We didn't. Gretchen Daly hadn't written her book yet, The New Economy of Nature. We hadn't started the Natural Capital Center with her yet. We just knew we needed to conserve this river for habitat purposes. But along the way came this new exciting tool that we're now beginning to use with the local flood control district as a source of potential capital, dollars, to help us pay for those easements. So I've thrown a lot of material at you. You can see, I think, that this field that I've been in my whole career, conservation, is now having this thing that we used to regard as sort of anathema, economics, creep into it. And I welcome it. I welcome it not as a replacement for the passion, not as a replacement for laws and regulations, not as a replacement for public goodwill, but as a complement to that, as another tool that we can use for conservation. So that brings us back to the Bay Area. Thank you. I probably don't even need to show you a slide like this because you all know you live here. We know we live in an amazing place with millions of acres of greenbelt. We also know it's at risk. How can natural capital, ecosystem services, how can we use that here in the Bay Area to build on the legacy of conservation that we already have. And I would suggest there's at least a couple of ways. One of those is something that one of your panels is going to address, I think, this afternoon, which is let's get in there and start quantifying some of the ecosystem services that our open space, our Greenbelt provides. And with that information in hand, perhaps we have a better chance of convincing the greater public to vote for the bond measures that we may need to permanently protect open space, right? May be able to argue persuasively that there are hidden values, previously unquantified values in those wetlands, in those rangelands, in those riparian corridors. Perhaps the public will find it persuasive. We all know as members of the public that we got the checkbook out a lot to protect the Bay Area. I think the figure that I jotted down was, where is it? 24 bond measures and tax increases since 1988. Bay Area voters have approved $1.6 billion to preserve parks, protect water, open space, et cetera. But maybe we're going to need more persuading the next time around. And perhaps this ecosystem services concept can help. Secondly, by quantifying the benefits that exist in open space, perhaps our decision makers, land use planners, infrastructure planners, will be able to factor the value of conservation in a much more powerful way. And I think that also can be tremendously influential, just having a decision support tool so that the argument, if you will, or the decision isn't just about, well, is this a pretty place, a place for biodiversity? No, yeah, it's those things. And it also can help protect your community against floods, or it can help provide habitat for bees that are needed to pollinate the ag fields nearby, et cetera. So even though I don't think we can quantify the benefits to Alec, my son, and his classmates from their trip to Point Bonita, we can quantify the ecosystem services that places like Point Bonita provide. And I think that can be a very potent source of new capital for all of us here in the Bay Area, of perhaps a better enhanced set of arguments to persuade our fellow citizens to vote to protect these places. And finally, also can be the basis of an important set of decision support tools for our leaders as they consider the value of conservation and open space. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions if there's time.
Yeah, there are other values that go along with protecting open space, just as we've heard Wendy say. In addition, Peninsula Open Space Trust lists mental health, physical health, nutrition when you're protecting production of food, clean water and air, the work that open lands do to cleanse nature, air and water, to improve, to add to the local economy, particularly as it relates to recreation and tourist activities. Protecting biodiversity is another way of valuing open space. And finally, as we all know, climate change adaptation, nature and open lands will play a vital role in addressing climate change as we go forward. Two other little items I'll mention. We do have quarters available with the guard in the back for those of you that realize that Oakland has a fairly hefty parking system here. So if you need change, the guard at the outside desk does have them available. You do need to fill your meter every 2 hours. And it's, I think, $2 an hour, so it's kind of hefty. But anyway, if you need quarters, we do have some available. And, all right, so Wendy will take questions. I now have some, and she'll answer from there. Let's see. The first question is, like public pensions, I imagine water funds require stable investment return to pay for its operations. In the 2008 Great Recession, were there adverse effects to the ability of funds to provide services in terms of using the services? And all right, so go ahead on that question. In the Great Recession, were there adverse effects to the ability of funding funds to provide services on open lands?
Great question. I'm sure that the interest that gets thrown off by those funds would have some variability, for sure. But I guess I would, and I don't know in 2008 specifically what kind of returns that fund provided. But we also know that in the absence of that fund, in great recessions, there would be less, perhaps no, source of capital to invest in protecting the watershed. So it may not be a perfect tool because it's subject to the market, but it is certainly a tremendous improvement over the absence of it.
Thank you. Another question is, how was the software for natural capital developed? Is it accepted as plausible?
Haha. So I'm trained as a lawyer. That means anything I say about software will probably be wrong. I just want you all to know that. I am not Gretchen Daly. How was the software developed? The software had its beginnings in a monumental exercise that the United Nations called for, the Millennium Environmental Assessment. And Kofi Annan asked, I think it was roughly 1,300 scientists from around the world contributed to this report, which came out, which was obviously initiated in 2000. I think it came out maybe 2002. And Professor Daly and a number of her colleagues were part of that, and they began, I think the roots of the software were there, assessing ecosystem services around the world that were provided by, obviously by working landscapes and intact ecosystems. At the end of the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment, she and others decided they needed to do more there, and so they created this software, this set of software models called INVEST, which stands for, anybody know? Anyway, it's basically trade-offs, a software system that enables you to quantify ecosystem services and then analyze the trade-offs, the costs and benefits. Is it accepted elsewhere? I think that's the good news. It is. This approach is not limited to the Nature Conservancy or the Bay Area anymore. Recently, a couple of years ago, 2011, the President Obama's Presidential Council on Science and Technology came out with a set of policy recommendations encouraging federal agencies to begin using, to begin quantifying ecosystem services and to begin to incorporate that set of analytics into their decisions. So I do think it has traction beyond, if you will, the usual suspects.
Thank you. Next, Bay Area marshlands, tidelands, wetlands. Have the dollar values of these been calculated?
Now, Sam, you're here. You may actually know the answer to that. We have the chair of the Coastal Conservancy, and I'll let him speak in a second.
All right.
But I would say there are efforts underway, And certainly, the person who wrote that question knows that our wetlands and estuaries have tremendous potential value in dealing with adaptation to climate change, as well as storm surges, et cetera. And Sam, do you want to say anything about
Yes, go.
the efforts?
Please, just push the red button.
Now, how's that? There we go.
Right, good.
Thank God I got a cup of coffee before you put me on the spot, Wendy.
Are you saying that my speech made you fall asleep?
No. We're actually running some experiments in that direction right now. The Coastal Conservancy is, for instance, funding the East Bay Dischargers Authority. These are all the sewage treatment folks who discharge into the bay from the East Bay, to see if it would be cheaper to create wetlands than to build a new treatment facility to meet the new rules for nitrogen and other things going into the waters. We're also working on natural flood protection in the South Bay with the Santa Clara Valley Water Authority and the Army Corps. And Wendy, I sure wish the Army Corps could get the good news about Obama's executive order, because I'm not sure that they have fully grasped that particular part of the gospel yet. And the other thing that we are working on, and actually we're doing this with the Nature Conservancy and others, is a protocol for carbon sequestration in wetlands, the idea being that because we know that wetlands sequester a great deal of carbon on a per acre basis, as much as a redwood forest, that if we could somehow monetize that and get revenue from the carbon market, that would be another way to pursue creating wetlands. So there's a lot. So I think the answer is no, we haven't exactly quantified the value, but I think there's some things in play that are trying to take this approach to the wetlands around the bay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Did you want to add something more?
I think one thing that Sam mentioned is really important, and that is that, well, everything he said is important, but the Army Corps comment is a good reminder that we are, anything we do in this space is going to be constrained by, if you will, existing laws, regulations, agency practice, et cetera, et cetera. And so in some places, like the Santa Clara River, the existing laws and agencies have been able to be nimble. It's a smaller geography. Obviously, the Army Corps of Engineers is less so. I was just going to say less so. And so, yeah, depending on where you are, the change may come more slowly or more readily.
Thank you. Next question is the urban limit line a defunct issue?
I have no idea. Sorry, I can't answer that question.
Well, I think the
yeah, why don't we
theory.
let the Greenbelt Alliance guy?
Right, I think, well, okay, Jeremy, I don't know. I think the concept has been that you get to protecting open space by limiting urban development within an urban limit line and minimizing development or protecting lands outside of that line.
Yeah.
And with now all lands being so important, is the urban limit line defunct?
I don't think it's defunct at all. If the question is, would this notion of natural capital replace the need for urban limit lines, I don't think we're anywhere near that place at this point.
Or perhaps it makes more importance. Who knows?
Over time. But I think we're still in the early days of this approach, if you will. Much has yet to be proven, and as Sam mentioned, there's a whole set of existing conditions, if you will, that we need to work within to make this possible. Do you, Jeremy?
Yeah, I'll speak to this really quick, and I'll talk about it in my remarks a bit as well. But I think Wendy said it, I think, in her presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Is that good?
There you go.
All right. Wendy said it in her presentation that the focus on economics, the focus on natural capital, is not a replacement for existing tools that we're using for conservation, including urban limit lines and including, I'd say, more generally policy. One of the maps I'll show is we have about 2 million acres right now that are protected in the Bay Area, not through any other mechanism other than policy passed by a city council or a county. And that's an incredibly important tool that we have to stay on top of.
Thank you. All right. The next question went back to you, Wendy. What other applications do you see for this concept? Fisheries restoration, preservation, sprawl prevention, climate change limitation. What else do you see for this concept of nature's value?
Well, one of the things that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did was identified 24 different ecosystem services. So I've talked about a few of them, obviously natural flood protection, drinking water, mentioned bees and pollination. There's a couple dozen more. We've talked about helping to adapt or be more resilient against climate change. But so the other applications for this approach really go to the numerous other ways in which nature provides benefits to humans. Now, how you apply that, whether it's in a policy conversation or an election to try to get people to vote to fund conservation, et cetera, I think the possibilities are vast. And certainly the Nature Conservancy, we are, as I mentioned, very, very gung-ho on this approach when it comes to water funds in Latin America. But we are also looking at it. I think there could be application for fisheries as well, and on and on. So depending on where you are and what the host of ecosystems is, will dictate, I think, what the services are that they provide.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.